9/11 Truth movement challenges the peace movement. I'm going to follow an autobiographical thread. I've been a member of the peace movement in my country, Canada, for decades, while I've been a member of the 9/11 Truth movement for only 4 years. I hope to explain the way I, as a peace movement, have been challenged, and that this will somehow help other people in the peace movement to allow themselves to be challenged, to allow themselves to hear what people in the 9/11 Truth movement have been saying. This talk is addressed mainly to people in the peace movement, and especially those in the peace movement who don't really get it yet about 9/11 Truth. I know that that's not you folks here tonight, so I'm assuming and hoping that the videotape of this might get out to some people who need to see it. Okay. So, since we're autobiographical, I'm going to start in February 2001. I was in Peshawar, Pakistan, helping to put on a peacemaking workshop for Afghans. The workshop was led by peace researcher Johan Galtung, and I was there as a member of the Center for Peace Studies at McMaster University, where I was a university professor. Our host was the Afghan University in Peshawar. In other words, we always work with people in the region in question, in war zones, and in this case with a great many Afghans. This workshop went on for about 8 hours a day throughout 5 days. There were 100 participants, about a quarter of whom were former Afghan cabinet ministers. Most of the others were academics, leaders of NGOs, or journalists. There's a lot of interesting stuff that happened at that workshop, but I just want to mention 2 of them for you. The first is I'd like to report that during those 5 days, as well as 2 further days with NGOs and the United Nations, many ideas were put forward to help create a stable peace in Afghanistan, yet not a single person, guess what, proposed that a foreign invasion and occupation of Afghanistan was the way to go. Most of the people we talked with considered the Taliban their adversaries, yet none suggested the Taliban had no part whatsoever in a future Afghanistan. On the contrary, they proposed a peace process to involve the Taliban, which we do not have in 2009. I can't imagine, I'm speechless that at the Bonn process in December 2001, a so-called peace process went ahead which excluded the people who had controlled 95% of the country. And then they are surprised that there's an insurgency. Not one single woman that I talked to there or when I visited Afghanistan earlier called for military strikes to save them from the Taliban. Their dominant view expressed repeatedly that we needed to end war and the culture of war in Afghanistan, that every effort needed to be made to end it creatively and with as little destruction as possible. And the second thing I want to report to you, in addition to those comments, was one that puzzled me at the time. A well-dressed male participant, probably former Afghan cabinet minister, stood up after a nice brainstorming session about what Afghans could do to make their country more peaceful, and said, and I'm quoting from the notes on the conference, "The USA is right now planning a war in Afghanistan." Okay, this was 6 months before 9/11. It's about oil and a base to protect their interests. They will build a base, they will be there for a long time, and unfortunately our discussions here today are of no avail. And then he sat down and there was silence. Given what we now know about foreknowledge of the fall 2001 invasion of Afghanistan, foreknowledge in Pakistan and India, it seems to me he wasn't just making a good guess. He was telling us what he'd learned, probably from Pakistani officials. In other words, he knew about the invasion of Afghanistan 7 months before it took place. We North Americans tend to talk a lot about our media, but of course our media didn't cover this, even though it was widely covered in India several months before the invasion. They said the United States will be invading in the fall. Well, I mentioned that fellow just to sort of say, shame on me, because when 9/11 happened, I should have had a little bit of a head start in understanding it as compared with most people in North America. So did I cotton on right away in 9/11 that this was a very fishy event? I'm sad to say I didn't. Let me be more precise about that. I mean, I'd studied and taught war for years by then. I was involved deeply in the peace studies program at my university. I had been to Afghanistan. I had heard this guy. I had no difficulty at all understanding that 9/11 was going to be used as a false pretext for the invasion of Afghanistan. Not a cause of the invasion, but a pretext. I knew the invasion was convenient for U.S. elites, just as the later invasion of Iraq was convenient. 9/11 gave them the opportunity they sought, both to secure fossil fuel resources and to position military forces in strategic locations. This part I understood, okay? And in fact, I think most people in the peace movement understood it. But what I didn't get is that 9/11 was a fraudulent trigger incident of the most extreme kind. Barry Zwicker and I were talking, what do you call these different kinds of events? It may sound a little over-technical, but I think fraudulent trigger incident is a good general category, and there's a whole bunch of subcategories, one of which is false flag operation. And I didn't understand that 9/11 was a false flag operation. So I want to ask a question here. Why didn't I? Why didn't I explore this more? And I'm asking this because I think there are a lot of people still in the peace movement who haven't been questioning enough, and maybe their reasoning goes a little bit like mine. If I had to use one word to explain where I was coming from back then, just after 9/11, I would use the medical word triage. You know, in medical emergencies, you establish priorities as to who you're going to treat first, based on severity of injury and likelihood that they'll benefit from treatment. My top priority after 9/11 was to prevent a Western invasion of Afghanistan. I saw this as a continuation of the manipulation of this wretched country. In 1995, in Afghanistan, I talked to a well-known Mujahideen leader, Abdul Haq, who told me that the Soviet Union and the United States both had used Afghanistan like toilet paper. This was a bitter man. He'd lost his leg in battle. People had come to kill him to his house. He wasn't there. They killed his wife and son instead. Shortly after 9/11, he himself was assassinated. This is a bitter man. Like toilet paper, he said. And it seemed to me, as I watched the preparations for the invasion of Afghanistan after 9/11, that this belonged to the toilet paper tradition of Western foreign policy. Afghanistan was being used. Thank you. So I worked really hard to prevent that invasion. Of course, we failed, at least in the short run. We failed to stop it. It had been planned way in advance, and they were committed to doing it. What next? What after that? Well, my next priority was to try and stop the invasion of Iraq. It became very clear quickly that that was next on the hit list. 10 million of us were on the streets protesting that. But again, at least in the short run, we failed. And by the way, far from being radicals, as sometimes said in North America, there are lots of polls taken at the time that show that the great majority of the people in the world opposed both of those invasions. There wasn't anything particularly radical about it. We were going along with most people in the world, which said that a different route altogether needed to be taken to address 9/11. Now, I've said triage, I've said I was busy doing this and busy doing that, but why not at least look at 9/11 a little more closely? Here's what I think was going on in my mind, as well as I can reconstruct it. First, it was the obvious thing that to get 9/11 would distract me from my urgent peace tasks. I thought that it was possible 9/11 was a false flag operation, but that it was unlikely. And I thought that this is one of these things that might take the rest of my life to get to the bottom of. I pictured myself drowning in quicksand, reading arguments for, arguments against, wasting my time, spinning my wheels when I could be out there on the streets or wherever trying to prevent these deadly invasions. That's what was going on in my mind. So I opened a little file in 9/11 and started putting anomalies into it, but I didn't do anything very serious about it. Now, when I reflect on this now, do I blame myself? Do I think I went off base there? Well, yeah, I do actually. How did I know that it would be difficult to figure out that the official narrative was wrong? I mean, admittedly, it is difficult to figure out who exactly did it, you know, what their names were and all the details of what they did, but it doesn't actually take long at all to figure out that the official narrative is rotten from stem to stern. So let me recommend to those of you in the peace movement who haven't done it yet to look at your busy calendar, and I'm not being cynical, I'm sure it's busy just like mine was, and block out 2 days and buy, let's say, David Ray Griffin's 2 books, The New Pearl Harbor and The New Pearl Harbor Revisited, and hide somewhere, right, for 2 days and read them. And then you can have a discussion with us. And if you still think we're all wrong, fine, I'll leave you alone. But if you haven't taken those 2 days, then I don't have much sympathy. Okay, I think that there were actually 3 main mistakes that I made in my thinking at that time. The first is the one I just told you. How the heck did I know it was going to be complicated? Invest a little time and look. The second mistake is that I didn't pay enough attention to the process of the construction of the official story and the process of figuring out what the response to the events was going to be. And here's a weird one. You know, like a lot of dissidents, I have contempt for a lot that's on television, and especially television quote-unquote news. Therefore, I don't watch it. This was a big mistake in this case. Let me tell you a time when television is invaluable. It's when a breaking story is being covered. The day of, even the day after. All kinds of stuff will find its way onto television, which will later be swept down the memory hole. Watch it. Watch it like a freaking fanatic. Take notes. You know, record it. It's invaluable. And I didn't do that. In fact, I emotionally couldn't bear it. I came home, I watched a plane crash into the Trade Center, and I said, I just felt sick. I don't like watching mass murder. I said, I cannot watch this. I didn't watch anything more. I understand my feelings, but the result was I didn't even see those bloody towers collapse for years. If I had, it might have helped. I want to give you a few examples of how it would have helped if I'd watched same-day coverage. Let me take CNN as an example here, although I could take lots of other networks. By the end, recently I've watched the 15.5 hours same-day coverage of 9/11 on CNN. Watched it twice. Surprised to find that by the end of that day, the journalists are accepting the following as true. 1, Osama bin Laden and his group did it. 2, the deed should be understood as an act of war. By the way, not obvious at all. Most people in the world, as we know from polls, thought it should be understood as a crime. No, it's an act of war. 3rd, it's an act of war. We need to respond with an act of war. Also not obvious. Next, states that support terrorist action are no different from the terrorists themselves and should be treated accordingly. Sounds reasonable. According to that principle, the government of Nicaragua could have legally bombed Washington when they were attacked by the Contras. And obviously then the conclusion is Osama bin Laden made these attacks from Afghanistan, and therefore a military invasion of Afghanistan is on our agenda. This is all during the first day on CNN. And there's a bunch of other points, but I won't get into them. How were these? If I had been watching TV, I not only would have seen how it was put together and who was putting it together. One grumpy old white man after another was brought on there. Members of the national security cult, Alexander Haig, George Shultz, Orrin Hatch, even Dr. Strangelove himself, Henry Kissinger, live from Germany on the telephone. We must prepare to eradicate the source of this. I'm not kidding. It's almost a direct quote. Listen, the point here is there wasn't a scrap of evidence. There wasn't a single logical argument. There was nothing said during the 15.5 hours that constituted evidence that Osama bin Laden had done this act. I didn't know that because I didn't watch it. I read the paper afterwards and I kind of assumed that there must be some sort of evidence. Well, let me tell you, there wasn't. And let me give you a couple of examples of what I mean. 3:44 p.m., anchor Judy Woodruff looks solemnly into the camera and says, quote, "Sources are telling CNN's national security correspondent, David Ensor, that there are, quote, good indications that people with links to the Osama bin Laden organization are responsible for today's attacks," unquote. Sources, Judy? What sources? Good indications? Give me one. Judy Woodruff is visibly embarrassed as she says this. She apologizes. Half hour later, she gets David Ensor, the security correspondent, in front of the camera and asks him if he can be a little more specific. He says his sources naturally aren't going to give us any specifics at this time. After all, it's secret. And he's visibly excited that he is allowed to have these secrets. The most he can tell us is the sort of things they will be looking at are passenger lists and airport videos. And I wish Judy Woodruff had said at that point, "Good thinking, David, but I don't want to know what they're going to look at. I want to know what they have looked at, which has led them to Osama bin Laden, and I want to see the evidence, and I want to show it to the American people, because going to war, David, is a big fricking deal." She didn't say it. And 8 years later, CNN still seems satisfied, though we still don't have authenticated passenger lists and we still don't have authenticated airport videos. So here's how it's supposed to work. The national security correspondent has faith in his sources. Judy is supposed to have faith in her correspondent, and we, the audience, are supposed to have faith in Judy, and it's not good enough. If I had been watching the construction of this story, I would have had a much clearer sense than I did of how pitifully weak it was. A second example, if I had watched television, has to do with the destruction of the World Trade Center. Not having watched the TV, I had the impression for some time after 9/11, and I think many people in the peace movement still do, that the official account of the demise of the Trade Center, broadly speaking structural failure due to jet impact and fire, was a kind of default position. Let me explain what I mean. The default position on something is something where you don't have to make a choice. It's kind of built in, it's obvious. By default position, I thought for some time that it was obvious to everyone on the scene, that they all thought, that they naturally thought, that they originally thought, that of course the planes had smashed into the towers and therefore the towers fell as a result of that smashing. And I thought for some time that the people came along talking about explosions, unrelated to the jet impacts, were somehow latecomers, revisionists, giving us a thing that we would have to go out of our way to choose. And I think many people in the peace movement still think this. Some of them say, well, I'm too busy, or I'm not a scientist, so I can't go with this exotic, late-coming hypothesis. I have to go with the obvious, natural default position. Well, it's historically false. Both of the positions that are the leading positions on the collapse, so-called, of the towers today were articulated between 10 and 10:30 a.m. That is, between the collapse of the South Tower and the collapse of the North Tower. They were the leading hypotheses then, and they still are. I'll give you a couple of examples from CNN starting at 10:28 when the North Tower comes down. And I'm not trying to prove the controlled demolition hypothesis here. I'm doing something that I think is easy. Well, it's easy to prove historically, and I think is more important than most people realize. I'm just saying that on the day of 9/11, it was articulated frequently and publicly that explosions may have brought down the buildings. This was later whisked down the memory hole. 10:28 a.m., CNN anchor Aaron Brown watches the North Tower come down live, shocked. And then he says whether there were second explosions, that is to say explosions other than the planes hitting them, that caused this to happen, we cannot tell you. End of quote. He then says he's got Rose Arce on the phone, the CNN producer who was outside watching the event. He says, "What do you got, Rose?" And she says, again, this is all direct quotations, "You saw the top of the building start to shake, and then the entire top of the building just blew up." Half an hour later, 10:57 a.m., Brown asked CNN correspondent Patty Davis what she witnessed when the South Tower came down. She explained she was 1,000 yards away from the South Tower when it came down and says, quote, "It was a massive explosion," end of quote. 10:46 a.m., Aaron Brown shows us a replay of the South Tower destruction and comments on it. I have to say, I feel sorry for the guy. Well, I don't anymore, but I did initially when I watched this, because I thought, what a weird position to be in, to be a television news anchor, where you've got a certain kind of objective reality going on the screen that you've got to give some kind of account of. But you've got everything from national myths to the pressure of the corporation that owns your TV station. You've got everything constraining you, and you're the guy you're the person that's supposed to mediate between these two. And this is a pretty raw example of how to mediate. He says, "It almost looks like one of those planned implosions." But of course there was nothing planned and it was not an implosion. Poor guy, what else could he say? If it was a planned implosion, the implications would be unthinkable. The mayor, Giuliani, is asked twice on CNN during the day whether explosions brought down the towers. To his credit, Aaron Brown asks at 12:30. He asks the mayor if there were explosions other than plane impacts that brought down the towers. The mayor says he doesn't think so, but he's not sure. 2:39 p.m., at a press conference, the mayor is asked again. This time he's got his briefing notes and he's a little more definite that seems to be just after effects of the planes hitting. But I want you to listen to the question that the female reporter, who's not on screen so I can't see her, I don't know who she is, listen to the question that she asks him at 2:39 p.m. on 9/11. "Do you know anything about the cause of the explosions that brought the two buildings down? Was it caused by the planes or by something else?" This is the middle of the day on 9/11 on CNN. This is what people on the scene were asking. She doesn't ask if there were explosions. She says, of course there were explosions. She doesn't ask if they brought the buildings down. She says, of course they brought them down. I just want to know what caused them. This has been swept down the memory hole. But you see, I didn't watch TV, and I missed the construction of this story. I didn't hear these people. I didn't hear the eyewitnesses. I had to read about all the eyewitness stuff years later. And I didn't see how weak the whole thing was. So here's the message to the peace movement on this one. When it comes to the collapse or the destruction of these towers, there's no default position. You have to choose between the same two hypotheses. And you can't choose on the basis of a chain of faith. You have to choose on the basis of a chain of evidence. If I were to think of broad terms to characterize these two sets of hypotheses, I'd call one the government hypothesis and one the non-government or civil society hypothesis. When I call one a government hypothesis, I don't just mean the U.S. government, the Bush administration, FEMA, NIST, all supported it. I mean that officially, at least, almost every government in the world supports it. Of course, whether they actually all believe it is another matter. But most of them, with the possible exception of, Venezuela, possibly Cuba and Iran, but with almost no exceptions, governments in the world have signed on to the official narrative. It's a government hypothesis. The alternative hypothesis all along has been supported by non-governmental people and organizations, or as we nowadays tend to say, civil society organizations. And it seems to me ironic and sad that the peace movement, which is one of the oldest civil society organizations in the world, which even in its modern phase is about 200 years old, and which understands in general the need to oppose government and question government, especially for God's sake, when it comes to war, and has developed its own intellectuals, its own newspapers and alternative media, has a foothold in the university, and all this stuff is somehow, for the most part, supporting the government hypothesis. Not good enough. And please don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying the peace movement should say, because governments say it, it must be wrong, or because civil society supports this one, it must be right. No, it's not a question of trusting anybody, but it's a question of respecting civil society enough to read the bloody stuff that they write. Thank you. And finally, I said I made 3 mistakes. I'm on the 3rd one now. We're getting somewhere here. We won't be going too much longer. The 3rd one is, you know, I was a university professor, supposed to be a smart university professor. When I was a kid, I thought university professors must all be geniuses. Secret, not true. But I mean, I was teaching peace studies, I was teaching about war, I had taught the Vietnam War to students, I had taught the Gulf of Tonkin incident to students. I knew about fraudulent trigger incidents. The Gulf of Tonkin incident was entirely fraudulent, but was used to trigger a war between the United States and much of Southeast Asia. You know, a digression here, in ancient Rome, when war was decided upon, a priest was sent into the temple of Mars, the war god. He would shake the sacred spears and say, Mars vigila, meaning wake up, god of war. Wake up. And off would go the Roman legions to devastate some place or other and add it to the empire. And it's not too much of an exaggeration to say that in August 1964, Lyndon Johnson came into Congress with his fraudulent Gulf of Tonkin incident and shook the sacred spears. He said, Mars vigila. And Congress stood up almost to a person and said, yes, wake up, God of war. The vote was 414-0 in the House of Representatives, 88-2 in the Senate. And the God of war woke up. And by the time he was finished with Southeast Asia, millions of people were wounded and dead, and whole ecosystems had been destroyed. That's what war does, and that's what a fraudulent trigger incident does, and I should have known. Not only does this lead to death of the enemy, of course, war, fraudulent trigger incidents lead to the restriction of civil rights at home. This is not a new insight. This is what war does. It doesn't just harm those attacked, it harms the host society. And I'm going to quote David Dodge here, who founded what is often said to be the oldest peace society in the modern peace movement in New York City, the New York Peace Society, which he founded in 1815. And he understood this principle. This is what he said: to inflame a mild republic with the spirit of war is putting all its liberties to the utmost hazard. I don't know what David Dodge would think of his mild republic today, which eats up half of the world's military expenditures. 190 states in the world, the United States spends half of the total military budget of the world. What happened to the mild republic? It was inflamed again and again and again and again, and the war system took hold and is very powerful, I'm afraid to say, in this society today. So, to get back to my rather fragile autobiographical thread, I should have been aware of my duty to study 9/11, to see if it was genuine, to teach my students about it, and I have done my best since then, especially in the last 2 years, to make the study of fraudulent trigger incidents and false flag operations part of the curriculum of peace studies at that university. Like most people in the peace movement, I understood enough after 9/11 to say the attacks of 9/11 do not justify invasions of countries. I was right to say this, and the peace movement was right to say this. But we missed the second thing we should have said, which is, when it comes to war, we don't trust governments. We don't trust the government's account of 9/11. We aren't satisfied with the chain of faith, and we're going to look into it ourselves. This has been a major failing of the peace movement. And this is one of the reasons the 9/11 Truth movement was even perhaps just a dash rude. And I don't suggest rudeness. I don't think it's usually very helpful. But he did challenge me, and he said, this is important. You must look at it. There's good work on it. You're not doing your homework. And I said, okay, recommend a couple of things and I'll read them, because you're right, I haven't done my homework. He recommended them, I read them, and of course I watched the official narrative dissolve before my eyes in 2 or 3 days. I want to offer that same challenge to the rest of the peace movement. This is important. How can you claim to understand war if you don't understand the events that trigger it? Barry and Ian stood up and gave us 55 examples of fraudulent events that lead to war and violence. You don't have to memorize the 55, but you got to understand the basics. And if you don't trust governments on war, then for heaven's sakes, look into this. Since 2005, then, I've taken it to be my task to be a civil society researcher and to participate in this amazing, probably historically unprecedented, civil society investigation, of which to which many people have contributed, including many of you in this room today. And I'm honored to be here with you, to be here with Richard, for example, at the back, who's contributed to this, and to all of you. We don't have time to go through the research I've done, but I do want to direct you to a place where you can find it. You just have to Google Journal of 9/11 Studies, open access, free peer-reviewed journal, and you'll find the 4 articles that I've written since 2006. And I'll just tell you what they are. The first one is 118 witnesses. That's where I look at the testimony of over 100 members of the New York Fire Department that they perceived explosions at the time of the collapse of the Twin Towers. Second article is called Waiting for 7, and it looks at the fact that dozens of firefighters knew that Building 7 was coming down long before it came down, sometimes over 4 hours before it came down. This is, of course, virtually impossible according to the official theory, where this was an unprecedented event, the first time in history that a tall building collapsed from fire alone. Third article is called The Missing Jolt, co-written with New Jersey engineer Tony Zambotti, in which we argue, in effect, that the fall of the North Tower, according to NIST, violates the laws of physics. Tony was here yesterday. I'm sorry he had to go home. I want to acknowledge him as one of the bravest and most insightful of your engineers on this issue of 9/11. Thank you, Tony, for all your work. And finally, the last article I wrote is, Did the Earth Shake Before the South Tower Hit the Ground? And there I argue there is strong evidence in the case of all 3 of the buildings that came down that the shaking of the earth began several seconds before visible collapse, not after. I'm just suggesting that you read the articles carefully, make up your own mind. As far as I'm concerned, the general conclusion is that NIST and the 9/11 Commission are wrong again and again and again, and not just wrong, but deceptive on one crucial matter after another. Friends, and here I mean not just the peace movement, but everybody, this is the worst possible time in history to inflame societies with the spirit of war. This is the worst time to be taken in by fraudulent trigger incidents. It's the most important time to reject the war system, cooperate with the rest of humanity to solve the grave ecological problems we face, which collectively threaten our civilization. As I draw this talk to a conclusion, I want to quote one of the members of the New York Fire Department, Kenneth Rogers, who was a witness on 9/11. We were standing there with about 5 companies, and we were just waiting for our assignment. And then there was an explosion in the South Tower. A lot of guys left at that point. I kept watching. Floor after floor after floor. One floor under another after another. And when it hit about the 5th floor, I figured it was a bomb because it looked like a synchronized, deliberate kind of thing. And I want to use his testimony as a kind of metaphor here. I want to say to the peace movement, the reason he saw things that others didn't is because he didn't leave the scene and he didn't turn his head away. He stood there and he looked at it, and that's all I'm asking the peace movement to do. Stop turning your head away. Don't flee the scene. Look at it, please.
Okay, I think we'll bring up my friend Joanne Kennedy now from Catholic Worker. Deborah Sweet from World Can't Wait was not able to make it, so I thought we would maybe bring up Joanne now. And just remember, feel comfortable, because the theme of the panel is peace movement, peace activism. You don't have to be a 9/11 truther to be on this panel, but it helps. But no, just kidding. No, you don't have to be a 9/11 truther to be on this panel. This is all about the peace movement and peace activism, and let's get a different perspective. Thanks. Joanne Kennedy, woo-wee!
Good evening. How are you? How's that? Is that okay? My bad. Okay. So, as Sandra said, my name is Joanne Kennedy, and I live and work at the Catholic Worker in this neighborhood. Thankfully, the conference was very nearby. And I'm not a truther. That's right, you heard me say it. I'm not a truther. To the extent that what it means to be a truther is to, like you folks here, dedicate this amount of time and energy to this particular issue. Do I think the government lies? I grew up after Vietnam. I mean, isn't that what governments do? Doesn't power corrupt? Absolutely. Of course they lie. And we can't, maybe it's because I grew up in California too, but that's what government does. It lies to people. And then eventually people get sick or something happens, and 20 years, maybe 30 years down the line, they're sort of forced to say something that gets closer to the truth, but you'll probably never get all the way there. And for me, the best example is Christine Whitman saying the air is safe to breathe. If anybody was here at that time and you breathed that air, there's one thing you know, and that air was not safe to breathe. Right? So from the very beginning, they were lying. And so I don't want to say that I don't support the truth movement, but it's just not the place where my energy goes. The Catholic Worker, for those of you who don't know, was started in 1933. It has been unflinchingly pacifist. It has opposed every war during its existence, including the Second World War, which was a really unpopular war to resist. But long before that war started, Dorothy Day was making it clear in the way that she could that what was happening to the Jews in Germany and Poland was going to be bad for the whole world, and that the solution was to stop this in the 30s, but that Pearl Harbor was not an excuse to become involved in that war. So I belong to a tradition that has long since been suspicious of events that make people call for war, because war is never, ever, ever the solution. So that perspective led us to watching the towers get hit by planes and collapse and saying, oh my God, how long till the war drums start beating, right? In our house, that's what happens that day. And my sister called me on the phone because I was out of the city and said they started to invade Afghanistan, and we cried. Like, we knew exactly what was happening and why that was happening. So I think it's important to remember that even though the Catholic Worker is kind of maybe the farthest personalist, anarchist fringe of the peace movement, we consider ourselves at home there. And one of the ways that we've found ourselves at home in the peace movement, which is this big, messy family full of all kinds of, absurd relations, is to stay focused on the real objective, which is to stop war, to educate people about what war does and how it is never a proper course. And so I would say, if my 2 cents are worth anything, because I know we want to keep moving, and I feel humbled by the company I keep here. These guys are a lot smarter and know a whole lot more than I do. But I think it's important, and one of the frustrations I have at all the big peace rallies, especially the big marches on Washington, is that you get 2 hours of people coming up to talk about their issues, and it feels competitive. And I think this is what's happened to us, is that we've allowed the overarching model to force us to turn on each other. And we cannot do that. We cannot allow them to script how we will behave toward each other and toward the world. You guys are too kind. But I mean, I think this is a room full of good people who want what's best for the world. And the fact that we feel injured, perhaps emotionally, politically, economically, by other factions from the same side of goodness is insane. And I think that, one of the biggest tragedies in Gandhi's life was partition. And, it was a real heartbreak to him that the people who united to get out from underneath England could not stay together. And we can't, we have to learn from that. We have to learn that the lesson for us is to love each other so well and to love our enemies so well that we cannot be brought down and be factionalized. So I say, keep on keeping on. More truth is better. It makes me very sad that so many people feel so afraid, because there's actually a lot of people. An anecdotal story, I have a friend who's a high school teacher, and he told another friend of ours that a lot of the kids in his history class think that maybe the truth hasn't been told about 9/11. We're talking about high schoolers, right? But these are kids who grew up in the post-Reagan era. I mean, I think young people don't believe the government tells the truth. So the story's not that hard to sell. You just got to keep making the noise and people will listen. We'll probably never know the whole truth. I believe that, because the people who have the truth aren't in the business of sharing it, because it's hard to control power when you share the truth. But having said that, I believe in transcendence. So the truth is in the people who live right and treat each other well and care for the planet and care for each other. So we don't really need their truth to be true to ourselves. That's all I have to say.
Thank you, Joanne. Thank you for the big turnout from Catholic Worker. All right. We have a Q&A, group discussion, questions for the panel. Mr. Doug White. Take it away, Doug. All right. Yeah. All right. Well, Doug wasn't trying to go out with the mic. If you go without the mic, everybody just take a couple steps this way. You gotta have an operatic voice. So, all right. If I don't project well enough, Sam, just say it. I don't know. I'm trying to. This is like the classic left illusion that you can go without the mic. And usually it doesn't work, but you gotta be loud.
If anyone is unable to hear me, just please raise your voices in the back, and I'll try and do a better job of projecting. First off, as a international activist and independent journalist, it seems absolutely ridiculous to me that the peace, environmental, and 911 truth movements are not on the exact same page. And I feel it's our job to help make that happen. And we ought to be asking ourselves, how can I do that? How can I do that? Plant the seed of that question in your own consciousness, because things will come up. They might surprise you. Carry a book with you. Write the ideas down. You're gonna be surprised if you ask yourself that question and plant that seed, because it's really important, because that's the job that we need to do. And if we don't do it, if we don't go forward together, okay, we are not going to bring about the result that we all want, which is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Okay, so we've got to do that. And it was Ben Franklin, who said, and I want to thank my friend Fred Stubbs. Where are you, Fred? Where's Fred at? Anyway, Fred reminded me that Ben Franklin said, if we don't hang together, we most assuredly will hang separately. So we must stick together. We must do that. Now, some of the things I may say tonight, you may not want to hear, and you may totally disagree with, and that's okay. That's fine. I feel it's important to say it anyway, because it expands the horizon of the potential possibilities for effective action, and God knows we need effective action, okay? Now, just to give you a little background, I was really upset, so upset, an entire year before we attacked Iraq. I knew it was coming. I knew right away. As soon as I saw the first, rattling of the sabers and beating of the tom-toms, I said, oh my God, the Bush administration has already made the decision to go to war. And I was really upset. And everyone said, oh, you're nuts, Whit. We'll protest around the world. We'll do this, we'll do that. And I was really, really upset. And of course, we all know what they did. They intentionally set up 911 the way they wanted to, and they used it to justify two illegal, immoral, atrocious wars. And in February of 2003, just before we were getting ready the U.S. government was getting ready to bomb Iraq, it was going to be happening any day, I said, well, I have to do whatever I can. My conscience said, I have to do whatever I can to stop this. And so I said, okay, go to Baghdad. Do whatever you can. Go to Baghdad. So I talked to Voices in the Wilderness, Kathy Kelly, I guess, right? And she told me how to get into the back door, through the back door, by flying to Tel Aviv and then going to Jordan. You can take a cab up to the border and cross up over into Jordan, and I did that. And then once you're in Jordan, you could walk to Baghdad. You could take a donkey, or any cab driver would be happy to take you. So there I am, and I'm on Jordan getting ready to go to Baghdad when it snowed. It snowed. Now, you're up in the mountains, but you're also in the Middle East, and they hadn't seen snow. They hadn't seen snow for 10 years. So here we've got 2.5 feet of snow, and all the kids are out of school, and I'm having snowball fights with the kids. And that snow probably saved my life, because I was making plans to go on to Baghdad. I had no idea what I was going to do when I got to Baghdad. That snow made me think about what I was going to accomplish there that might make a difference. And I said, well, I really don't want to go and help Saddam Hussein set up his defenses. And I decided I would be better off going back to France and Great Britain and hooking up with journalists, since I was an independent journalist, and writing arguments, writing op-ed pieces, doing whatever I could. And one of the things I ended up doing, and this is a true story, okay, I walked in to the offices of the BBC in England. I walked up to the woman receptionist, and I said, my name is Doug Whit. I'm an international activist and independent journalist from America, and I want to make a $1 million donation to the BBC. And she went, and would you please call down a vice president so I can speak to him, okay? And after about 10 seconds, she picked up the phone, called down the vice president. I introduced myself again, took out my checkbook. I said, I want to make a $1 million donation to the BBC. Here's the check. and here's what I want in return. I want 1 hour on international television from 9 o'clock to 10, from 9 p.m. to 10 p.m., and I want the entire panel to be a peace panel that's going to tell us all the reasons why we don't need this war. Well, he said to me, we're an agency of the state and we can't accept donations. I don't know if he was telling me the truth or not, but I said, well, hold on to the check. I'm flying back to the States tomorrow. Here's my phone number and address. Okay, if you change your mind, call me up and we'll go ahead with it. Okay? And the following day, I flew back, and people said to me, well, you know you didn't have $1 million in your bank account. How could you do that? And I said, because I had the power of my own beliefs and convictions, that if they had said yes, I would have gotten on the internet and raised that money in 24 hours. I had the belief that I could do that. And if they had gone ahead with that peace panel, I would have been one of the 4 members on that peace panel. And at some point in that international broadcast, I would have gotten up and I would have made an appeal to the international musicians of the world, the Paul McCartneys and Bonos and all the rest of them, to immediately come to Iraq, because we're going to have an international music festival, and that millions of people should come for the festival, because they wouldn't dare bomb it with all those people there. Okay? That's what I was going to do, and I still think it would be a great idea for preventing war. So on the morning of 9/11, I was teaching public school in Paterson, New Jersey, 12 miles away. And obviously, like everyone else, we had a lot of fear, a lot of trepidation, a lot of concern. More than anything else, I had nothing but 100% compassion for the victims, for the people who were killed and their families and loved ones. That's all I had in the beginning. And, I'm from Westfield, New Jersey, which is an hour outside of New York City, and an 8th grade girl from my hometown got not 1 phone call from the World Towers, but 2 phone calls from both parents. And my heart, when I heard that, my heart sunk through my feet right into the ground. I couldn't even talk. So I had nothing but complete compassion for the people who suffered. And the first piece that I wrote was 911, an international cry for help. Because I thought that 911 was a symbol for the suffering of the world, and we ought to pull together to address the deeper world problems, all the poverty and 30 civil wars that are going on, and people not having enough food and water and everything else. That this was an international cry for help. I don't even know where that came from, but it came. And in the beginning, I really didn't know. I really didn't know if the U.S. government had anything to do with this or not. I was just open. I was just completely open. And then I read Barry Zwicker's book, Towers of Deception, and I say, yeah, Towers of Deception. Why is the media covering up 911? And after I read Barry's book, right away I got it. Right away I got it. And at that point, from that point on, I became a real strong, bona fide 911 truth activist. 2 years ago, I was really, 2 years ago in December of 2006, I was really, really upset with the peace movement. I just felt that we had not made an effort to come up with a strategy that had any possibility of being effective or impactful in terms of stopping these wars. And I was so upset that I was at the point where I just couldn't, in all good conscience, I couldn't sit by and do nothing. And my conscience said, get out there and burn American flags and make sure they're other people's flags and the government's flags, because we need to wake up some people. We need to wake them up. Because my question to the American people is, why in this world are you flying our national symbol, our national icon that represents things like freedom and justice and fairness and peace and truth and goodness, okay? You're telling me that we're going to be flying Old Glory, our national symbol, while we're waging these two atrocious, abominable wars? I really think you ought to think about that. Okay? And I had read a lot of Gandhi's material, and Gandhi said, you know, sometimes you got to do a satyagraha by yourself. And if no one else is willing to go along with you or come along, you got to do it anyway. Okay? Now, I knew they were going to come down on me. I knew they probably would physically hurt me. Okay, that I'd be arrested. As it turns out, I was hurt. I was thrown into solitary confinement lockdown 3 whole weekends. I had my truck towed 6 times. They did everything and anything they could to hurt me, but before they did, I went to the local newspaper because my mission was to motivate and inspire the peace movement and the 911 truth movement to get together on the same page and go forth as one confluence.
They were like, I said, and I said to Tracy too, what part of the electromagnetic spectrum are we talking about? Incidentally, we have one mistake. If you want to grab Tracy, I found one mistake. I think I told you.
Yeah.
On her website,
Yeah.
she lists what her PhD thesis was.
Yeah.
That she misspells the correspondence she studied.
Oh,
She put the Y in the wrong place.
No, I think I'll give her a break there.
You could offer it as a gentle reminder kind of thing.
No, if I can't hit her over the head, why bother? Anyway, this is what I found about 5
Camembert cheese.
No. Spires down the second.
Oh shit, this is dangerous. This is...
Yeah, I opened it up to see what it is. It looks like it's wrapped in paper.
Really? It's French or French?
I don't know, I think it's American to American.
Really? So they don't tell you. They tell you who's distributes it. It's kind of cold then to tell you where it's made.
Probably red china. Boy, then nobody'd buy it.
I mean, isn't it against the law not to tell you what country it's come from?
I don't know. Maybe it's from Israel. There's a lot of people boycotting Israel, so they don't put the date on it.
I'm going to have to report this. So I took out my picture of proving that it was an explosion, not a collapse,
Yeah?
and showed it to this guy I made friends with in Arizona,
Yeah?
who's a doctor in Arkansas, who has a heavy-duty 9/11 web thing where he'll send you all kinds of free DVDs. And he turns out to be the cousin of Steve Tweeden. You know who he is by now?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And what's weird about their cousin relationship, their fathers were brothers. They met once when he was 11 years old, and they didn't meet again until he was 59.
Yeah. Isn't that supposed to be recording or something?